In this lecture, let's think about how to teach the vocabulary of the lesson. Here is what one person has done. They've gone to the internet and they've grabbed pictures of the vocabulary items and teach the vocabulary from these pictures. Now, obviously, the good thing about this is that it's very close to reality, but you've got to go online, you've got to get the pictures and make up a PowerPoint. Then he used the words, the new vocabulary in the lesson that students have to fill in the blank. 车站旁边有一个, now what is it? Oh yes, 卖菜的,他的菜不但很, what's the word? Oh yes, 新鲜, 也很便宜. So he got them practicing the vocabulary items by getting them to fill in the blanks with the right words. Then making up a story using the vocabulary items. That's a bit more challenging, but is helpful. One thing I want to say right at the beginning is that often when teachers teach the new vocabulary to the student, they say, right, now here's the vocabulary word, you make up a sentence in Chinese. And actually most students don't like that at all. And what I'd like to suggest is, rather than first getting the student to make up a sentence, which may be wrong anyway, and then the student is discouraged, that you, the teacher, you make up 3 sentences using that word. That's going to give the student an idea of how to use it, and then get the student to use that vocabulary word to make up a sentence. So you first give him 2 or 3 examples of how that word is used in sentences, and then get them to make up a word, then get them to make up a sentence. Now, what's good is that maybe you prepare the vocabulary cards, but actually even better, get the students to prepare the flashcards, the vocabulary cards for the lesson. And actually, not just 1 set, 2 sets. We'll see in a minute that the one of those sets is that the picture of the word, strawberry, one side, and then the other side, they've written the Chinese, the pinyin, 草莓. So there's one. This one, let's assume the picture is of an egg, and so on the back, written 鸡蛋. Here is pineapple, and on the back, 菠萝. And the student brings these to class. That's going to help them think about the vocabulary. Another set which you'll need to get them to prepare is actually that they print them out again, and they have the picture one side and the other side is blank. We'll see why in a minute. So actually they really need 4 sets. 1 set, or rather 2 sets, same picture, on the back the pinyin, the Chinese, and then another set, just the picture and nothing on the back. And get them to do that for homework and to bring them along to class. I think it's very important that when you're teaching the vocabulary that you use a varied approach, not just simply going through the vocabulary list, read this after me, 红绿什么. The students find that very boring. So when teaching the vocabulary, we need to test 3 things. We need to test their memory. We need to test the production. Can they say the word? And we need to test their listening. Do they understand when you use that word? So these 3 things. We need to test, when we're teaching the vocabulary, memory, have they remembered the word? The production, making the word. And thirdly, listening comprehension. Do they understand the word when it's used? And so we need different activities for each of those. So let's start off by thinking about testing the student's memory. Now, you could do it this way. You could have these vocabulary cards. One side is the English, and the other side, they don't have to be colored, but these were, one side is the English, and the other side is the Chinese. And so you say, here is one, tell me what the Chinese is, and they have to say yi, and then you do it the other way around. This is shi, tell me what the English is, and they say the word stone. But actually, there's much more fun ways to teach vocabulary. I think students are going to find that pretty boring after a little while. So what are some of these ways? Well, one thing you could do is to lay out some of the vocabulary cards on the desk, give the student 1 minute to look at them, and then you cover them up so the student can't see them, and they have to write down the pinyin, not the English, the pinyin of as many of the words that they can remember. That's going to help them get it into their long-term memory. Another way, and I'm going to use the whiteboard, is called mind mapping. You take a topic. Let's take the word breakfast. Sorry, I should be writing this in pinyin, not in English. You take the word breakfast, 早餐, and then that's the topic that you want to think about, and then the student has to think of as many words linked to 早餐 as possible. For instance, they think of cafe, they think of tang, they think of 牛奶. Then they might think about, oh, 豆浆, if they like Chinese breakfast, 豆浆, 油条. Then they might think of, oh, if they like a Western breakfast, they think about 面包. And what's linked with 面包? Oh, 果酱. Oops, sorry. Let me write it correctly. 果酱. This is useful because they can use the words, not only the words covered in the present lesson, but this is a way of reviewing vocabulary already covered. And so this is helpful, it's fun, and it's challenging. And so that's going to help the vocabulary get into the memory, into long-term memory. So take a topic, it may be sports, maybe the weather, and then try and think of as many words linked to that vocabulary item as possible. One other way of doing this, similar to that, is that the student starts a word chain. For instance, the student says 橘子, and then the teacher, or if there are other students in the class, they carry on the word chain. They have to say something related to that word. So the first student said 橘子, and then another student then says 苹果, and then another student says 电脑, thinks of 苹果电脑. And in this way, see how long they can keep going, joining up the word chain. This is again helpful because they can bring in, just like mind mapping, they can bring in words that they've learned before, or even words that they actually learned on the street. And again, it's challenging them to see how much they can recall. And that challenging them to see how much they can recall is going to get it into long-term memory much more efficiently. So there's 3 ideas for memory: the vocabulary cards on the table, give a minute to the student, cover them up, the student then writes the pinyin. The second one, mind mapping, they're called, or word mapping. Take a topic and the student sees how many words they can think of related to that topic. Or the word chain game. starting with one word, and then the student has to say another word linked to that word. They go on. So those are going to help get it in. As well as memory, we need to test production. Are they saying it okay? One way we could do it is to lay the vocabulary cards here on the desk. And now let me get it the right way around this time. The student says a word in Chinese, and the teacher has to point to it. Okay? So the student says 国将, and the teacher has to point to it. And actually, if you want to make it a bit more fun, the teacher could sometimes point to the wrong item just to test the student. Now, of course, the problem with this is that the student is only going to say the words that they've remembered. So having played that game for a little while, then what you want to do is the student to say the word, and when they've said the word, then turn it over until you've turned them all over. Or, of course, the ones that aren't turned over are the ones that the student has forgotten. Okay, that's one thing. Another way is that you can take two sets of vocabulary cards with the blank side up, and that you, the teacher, and the student, you have to try and find the pairs, match it. But when you or the student turn any of the cards over, you have to say the word in Chinese. So you take this and say, 蛋糕, and this one, 鱼. All right, that's not a pair. All right, now it's the student's turn. Oh, what's this? 香蕉. And this is, 香蕉. All right, they're mine. So that's another way, a fun way, of testing production. Can the student say the word? Another way is to give the student a whole pile of vocabulary cards and get them to group them into different topics. So, for instance, the lesson on fruit and vegetables, you give them all the vocabulary cards and they have to sort them, the vegetable ones together and the fruit ones together. And then you get them to say each word. One thing you could also do, this is more for verbs, is then the teacher, the student commands the teacher to do a certain action, like 站起来 or 出去 or 坐下来. That way you can get the student producing or saying the verbs. So that's 4 ways to test production. Let's go over them again. The student, the pictures are picture side up. The student says a word in Chinese and the teacher has to point to that card. Then the student turns them over, so the blank side comes up, and as he turns them over, he says the Chinese. That's one. Then the second one is finding the pairs. So you and the teacher play the game together, and as you and the student turn them over, again you have to say the word. Then the third thing is to get the student, give them all the vocabulary cards, and not just maybe for that lesson, but for all the vocabulary up to now, and get them to group them into topics. Name a topic, fruit or vegetables, and they have to put them together. And then finally, for verbs, get the students to command the teacher to do something. That's testing production. So that's production. Thirdly, what about testing listening? Well, 老师说, the student we laid the vocabulary cards on the desk, picture side up, and when the teacher says a word, the student has to point to it. So the teacher says 国将, and the student has to point to it. Or the student has to pick it up. In this way, you're testing the students' listening production. When they say the word, do they recognize the object? Okay, the teacher says 香蕉, and the student has to go, oh, yes, it's this one, and they can point to it. Another way is to play bingo, that the student, they write down 9 words in English, and the teacher says different vocabulary words, and the student has to check whether they have those words on their bingo card. Now, it's important that the teacher checks that the student heard the right one or checked off the right one. The student might have checked off the wrong one. But this is another way to see if the students can understand the word when the teacher says it. So there's 2 ideas. 老师说, the teacher says a word, and the student either points to the card or picks it up. Secondly, bingo. The student writes down 9 words, 9 vocabulary words in English. The teacher says the word in Chinese, and the student has to check them off. Finally, testing understanding. For instance, the teacher says an action, 出去, and the student has to walk out. Then the teacher says 进来, and the student has to come in. The teacher says 坐下, 站起来, and the student has to do the action. One other way you can do test understanding is in Chinese called 连连看, is that you can have 4 sentences here, but each has 2 clauses, but the clauses don't match, and so you have to match them up. This tests understanding. For instance, the first sentence, 你去麦当劳的时候, is it 顺便帮我买2张邮票? No, I don't think so. 你去麦当劳的时候会顺便帮你问第一班飞机是 No. 你去麦当劳的时候大概会顺便去法国看一个 No. 你去麦当劳的时候请顺便帮我买一个冰淇淋 Oh, that's the one. And so you link them up. This was practicing the word 顺便. But it tests understanding. Does the student understand these sentences? Then, of course, obviously, you can ask the student about their everyday life. For instance, the word coffee, 咖啡, came as a new vocabulary item in the lesson. So you can ask, 你喜欢喝咖啡吗? And then you can ask, 你每天喝几杯咖啡? And so on, ask some questions. Sure, you do that anyway. Finally, with understanding, you, the teacher, can get the vocabulary cards and group them, put them into vegetables and fruits and that sort of thing. But some of the cards you deliberately put in the wrong group, in the wrong pile. And so the student has to look through and say why it's in the wrong group. For instance, if this 菠萝 you put with vegetables, then the student says, 菠萝不是菜, 是水果. So that's challenging the student that they understand what's vegetables and what's fruits, and then they can practice them. They can practice them. So that's testing understanding. Saying the action, joining up the phrases correctly, then asking the student about their everyday life, and then finally getting the students to put the vocabulary cards in their correct groups. So using these different ideas, rather than just simply going through the vocabulary list, 红, 绿, 蓝, 什么, is going to make not only more interesting, more fun for the student to learn the vocabulary, but it's going to help the student get it into their long-term memory much more effectively because they're investing mental energy on it. So why not try these out with your students? Okay, thank you.